it's very hard to take these imperfections and create anything of any great generality with it. It's just very hard. They're little baby examples of everything. Very, very hard to develop it. Something more sophisticated, although I'm again, oversimplifying. There's a lot of interesting work. The one exception, one thing that sort of worked its way into this vision of the perfect world is sometimes called New Keynesianism, which basically allows for frictions in labor markets where price, wage doesn't necessarily equate supply and demand. Now, frankly, there's a very uneasy truce over that because although Keynes advanced that idea in the 1930s to try to explain 25% unemployment in the Great Depression, where obviously supply didn't seem to equal demand, or at least it seemed obvious that price wasn't moving to equate supply and demand. But the truth of the matter is it's very difficult to add that in, and it's not the true intellectual foundations are poorly understood. However, until the financial crisis, people had little question of this assumption of perfect financial markets. Perfect beyond your imagination. It's not just that you don't have crises, it's that there's a market for everything. And by the way, the theoretical economists very conveniently neglected the fact that if you look out at the real world and you look out at markets, 75% of traded global financial assets, at least citing McKinsey Global Institute, is debt, plain vanilla debt. It's not indexed to what your mortgage isn't indexed to home prices. Portugal's debt is not indexed to Portuguese GDP, et cetera, et cetera. That is not the way the macro models work. And that departure between debt in the real world and the way the models work proved a very big problem yet again when the financial crisis happened because, in the model, everything's indexed. We don't have big debates over what Greece pays or what subprime mortgage holders pay. It's just instantaneous. And of course it's not. And so just as it took 70 or 80 years to try to build in Keynesian frictions, we're going to work on sovereign debt. Now, I'm sorry, on financial frictions. And there are a lot of papers floating around, but I will only say that once we depart from supply equals demand, we're on thin ice. It's not so easy. Now, you may ask me, by the way, about other areas like behavioral economics, which is very, very interesting. And I teach at Harvard. It's very active research there. But again, painting with a broad brush, there is a problem that once you go away from this supply equals demand and price moves, you find yourself with 20 different models for 20 different phenomenon. Works maybe well for studying advertising, certain things that have certain practical value, but it's yet to sort of gel into this cohesive science, that we think of as economics. So there are many ideas about frictions, a lot of competition for having the best model. It's not there. Sovereign debt, that's actually been studied for 30 years. That's very clear. And Carmen Reinhardt and I in our book studied the history of sovereign debt and sovereign defaults. There's a lot on that. That's well understood. But as someone who's worked on that a lot, we understand a lot about it, but it's not that easy to integrate into really practical models. There are limitations. Another example of something where there's been work for about 30 years is on banking. Banks don't exist in the mainstream model. They're not there. We don't need them because we just somehow magically have all these markets work without them. But of course, in the real world, there are frictions, there are practical needs. Well, there's a field of banking, there's a literature on banking, but it's still a very, very infant stage. There's a very famous paper by Douglas Diamond and Philip Dybvig. I teach it. It's a beautiful little model, but it's exactly that. It's a very, very simplified little model, not very easy to generalize. In fact, it hasn't led to that much yet, despite being very widely taught, because it's so exceptional. And this really boils down to what, what some of the mainstream economists, what is currently the mainstream would say, and Ed Prescott, who's certainly a great man and done, many great things, he says, okay, I know there are information frictions, and I know there are all these other problems, but show me how you build them into a very general model, and I'll be happy to do it. And that's sort of the point of departure of the debate. Now, one thing I think that's gotten a little lost in all of this is empirics, the theory that plays such a prominent role, and a lot of what passes for empirics is basically computational versions of these theories. And the idea of looking at economic history had fallen incredibly out of fashion until recently. Most of the major economics departments closed the field off, deciding there was nothing there, that there wasn't enough interesting research. And of course, my work with Carmen Reinhardt, my brilliant co-author, we worked on a book for 7 years. It's an economic history book. We look at 8 centuries of financial crises across more than 66 countries. And I think that proved very fruitful because financial crises happen regularly if you have a long time span, but they don't happen very regularly if you just look at 20 or 30 years. And even though there are problems with the data, it's very informative to look at it. And fortunately, I think history has been somewhat rekindled, and there are a lot of students going into it. And I want to make an I don't know if you'll think it's an interesting analogy, but it interests me as an analogy to why history's come back. It's not really just because of the financial crisis that helped, but it's because of the internet. Historical research is incredibly tedious. Some of you have probably done it, combing libraries. I did a paper in the 90s where I remember needing egg prices from the 1600s for the Netherlands. And I remember visiting Tilburg University, and the students thought it was hysterical that I was going through their library looking for egg prices from the 1600s. It's very tedious. And now, with the internet, you can more easily do that kind of research. The data is not on the internet, not much of it, some of it. But you're able to find books in libraries, request them, contact scholars, look at rare book dealers, and that's really what Carmen Reinhardt and I did. That's really the root of it, of the data set that we put together that gives us a more quantitative approach. And anyway, the analogy I wanted to get at was a little bit like mining, where at least I know this about the United States, I assume the same is true here, you can find a copper mine, a silver mine, where there was a big discovery, it was mined, and then they gave up. But then a new technology is discovered 40 years later, they go back to the mine, and they make more money. And that happens again and again. There's 3 or 4 cycles of this. You're probably very aware of it going on in energy. Shale gas is sort of a very recent example of that. And in a way, that can go on in economics. So even, I made this analogy at the beginning to when we have robots do help us much more actively with our research, we will really want, some of these mathematical techniques, some of these algorithms, which seem very impractical at the moment. I mean, they surely will be. The research needs to be done. But again, I think we're in a cycle where empirics is very important, and where despite the current ideas being very vested and entrenched at top journals and top universities, there really is a need for a significant change, because yes, 100 years from now, perhaps it's going to be very useful, but we've got to get there to the 100 years, and there are a lot of interesting questions. I've mentioned externalities, the environment, it's obvious. Okay, you say, well, don't we know about that? Yeah, there's studies of that, but it's very hard to put in your model. And because it's very hard to put in your model, people don't that much when they're doing more general macroeconomic models. And I think I go further to say that it actually, because it's not in the models, that influences policy. And I'll close with an example of that. Political economy is another example that in the financial crisis, it's just obvious that that's very important. But political economy, certainly plays a very big role. In the financial crisis, I'll follow the United States. The Congress was very influential in setting the environment in which it occurred. The housing crisis, the regulation or lack thereof of the financial industry, a lot of that had to do with, I think, people in government wanting to do the right thing. I wouldn't say by any stretch of the imagination it was all corruption. That would be a wild overstatement. But you can look at certainly the 2008 presidential election, look at all the candidates, and you'll find that a huge majority of the big donors were financial firms. You can look at the Senate, the House races for many years, and that was the case, and it certainly has an effect. I'm gonna give an example of this that sort of puts together all these things with an area that I don't work on much, but my spouse does. My spouse does children's television, and so she has a television program she's coming out with about obesity. It's a sitcom, but it's supposed to subtly influence people to be more healthy in their life, which is sort of a very important topic in the United States because, believe it or not, the Center for Disease and Control in the United States categorizes 1 out of every 3 adult Americans as obese, and I think 17% of children and adolescents as obese, which is a measure of body mass, at 3 times what it was in 1980.